And we are live. Welcome to another episode of the New York Information Security Meetup. And I have the great pleasure to introduce Joseph Davis, who is a Chief Information Security Advisor, Cybersecurity Advisor for Microsoft. Welcome very much, Joseph. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, David. I love the intro music, by the way. It's very
Thank you.
Club 90s.
It's a work in progress. Hey, so before we get started, you have such a big role. And, you know, I'm sure people are wondering, how do you ones get something into this kind of role? What was your path that you take along the way, to become such a senior advisor for some very large organization? Maybe you can walk us through that.
Yeah, it's kind of a 30-year history. I don't think we have enough time to go into all of it in great detail, but
Cliff notes.
Just kind of cliff note it. Yeah. So, I started out my world, being a physician and really not liking it. And I blog a lot about this on my LinkedIn profile. I did not want to be a physician. It was a dream of my parents and not mine. Finally kind of realized self-autonomy and basically hung up my lab coat and walked into a temporary job. But after that temporary job, it had nothing to do with IT, by the way. It was at a printing press because, you think about the context. It was the early 90s and it was the Vermont area, the state of Vermont, and there really wasn't a lot going on work-wise.
So I should really refer to you as Dr. Davis.
No, not really, because I don't have a license to practice. So
okay, but you went through you went through all the schooling. Like, I mean, you've done many years of school, right?
Yeah.
Wow.
But that's and a lot of my knowledge is 30 years old at this point. So unless you're going into diabetic coma or you're having a basic heart problem.
But you know how it is. It's first of all, it's not just about what you learn. It's the aptitude and the ability to learn and do that on a continuous basis. So just the fact that you went through all that schooling, proves that you have a certain skill set that not a lot of people have. I think you're diminishing that a little bit, but you're, obviously you've done all that schooling and you've done well, and then you decided that you wanted to take a different path. But that's impressive by itself that you've gone through all that schooling and you managed to to do well in it. And then from it's just like cybersecurity, right? Whatever was happening like 10, 15 years ago is almost not irrelevant, but still has fundamentally is the same.
Yeah.
But with a lot of changes. So sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no, that's fine. It's the two things I walked away with were, and I don't think med school did this for me, but I have like this Rain Man capacity to memorize useless facts about things, and I've cybersecurity quite well, as a storyteller and as a rewriter of my own personal experiences in history. The other thing I walked away with was the sense of serenity and calmness around really severe incidents. And we've, throughout my career, I've been exposed to all kinds of incident response situations, from internal fraud forensics to, active nation state attacks. Because as a CISO, and I haven't gotten to that point yet, but even before as a security architect and then moving into the CISO role, many of the companies I've worked for did not, back in the day, have an incident response plan. And of course, not only was I pulled in at the last second when something bad would happen, but I was also tasked with kind of building out these incident response plans. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. Here's the thing, right? When a patient walks in, especially I was doing a lot of rural medicine in a little town in Brandon, Vermont. And it was mainly a logging town. And many of the patients we'd see, of course, they'd have their illnesses would span the gamut, but the traumatic injuries that we saw were pretty bad around logging, which is, lacerations, amputations, crushing.
Wow.
And those types of things that would probably make someone, run away and not want to treat them. But my focus has always been like, I don't really get grossed out by those things because my focus is treating the patient and bringing things back to normal. And that's really, I took that with me into my incident response programs, not to let the actual incident kind of get in the way of solving the problem, right? That emotional, visceral response with the...
And that's incredible. I mean, because I always ask, if there are any applicable skill set that you learned from your past life, and that by itself, it's like interviewed an FBI agent and said that just similar to what you mentioned,
Exactly.
when, shit hits the fan, they basically calm down instead of, getting all stressed out. So they basically act the opposite. And you've seen some pretty horrific, I'm sure, logging accidents, and you were able to take that skill set of, bringing yourself down and assessing the situation instead of panicking, which I think 99% of the people would do.
I always tell the story of, the loggers who would come in holding their right arm in their left hand, that kind of thing. And I'm not even joking. I mean, it's
No, of course it's.
and there
I'm
weren't.
laughing because I'm nervous.
There was no EMS, right? So 9 times out of 10, a buddy would drive them in the pickup truck to our facility. We were 50 miles away from any hospital at the time, and then of course we'd have to get the airlifts going, but we'd have to perform, initial treatment because you can't let the patient bleed out. So let's not get too far into that. But it's one of those things. I think the only thing these days, and I'm in my 50s, I think the only thing that stresses me out in my 50s are deadlines and basically having my time managed for me. But but outside of that, really, I don't get stressed when you would think I should get stressed. It's kind of a strange neuro pathway that's been developed in my brain. You would think when the shit is hitting the fan, I would be running around swinging from the chandelier with my hair on fire, but I'm not. I'm usually doing that when I have a deadline I have to hit.
And how do you instill that? And we're getting yourself ahead of ourselves, but how do you instill that to other people when you have that conversation? Let's say in the case of like a cybersecurity emergency, you're the one who's calm and collected, and then everyone else is panicking. How do you then how do you manage that?
I'm not going to say it's easy. It's difficult. Everybody responds in their own way.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, sometimes the response, especially at the leadership level, is quite negative. One of the things that you have to manage as a CISO or another cybersecurity professional involved in that process is managing expectations around root cause analysis and expectation around how far you are in the investigation and when to decide to actually put the fire out. I mean, we're kind of conflicted as cybersecurity professionals of examining the fire to understand exactly the attribution, who is it, what is it, why is it, versus, all right, stop the bleeding so that we can get back to business as usual. And it's kind of that balancing act that becomes very, very difficult to manage. I don't think I have a silver bullet in managing that. I think all the advice that I could give the audience is be frank but diplomatic. Rely on your own experience. Rely on your own self-confidence. There are many CEOs and CAOs out there, COOs, etc., who right away they're looking for what's the source? I need to blame someone. I need to cover my tracks. There's liability here. I don't want to be the one that goes down because of this. And so you kind of have to get past that and say, look, we'll deal with that once we have gotten to the root cause here. Let's just focus. Let our technicians, let us focus on finding out what's going on, and then shutting it down so it doesn't make a huge impact on the business.
Mm-hmm. We're going on a tangent here, but I really like it. So, in terms of managing that incident, and as you mentioned, you were in a situation where people were panicking. It really helps to create a plan, right? For let's talk a bit about that, and also, I've talked to other professionals who mentioned that it's best to have a conversation ahead of time with somebody like yourself, and not have you getting to introduced to everything, all the moving parts, when the incident happens, because it makes your life much easier, and then it enables a quicker resolution at that time of that something happens. Is that correct?
Yeah, like or dislike Hillary Clinton, I think she said the greatest thing when she said it takes a village. It really does, right? So when you're going through your medical school training, when you get to the clinical part, that's when you're really exposed to these things, and you kind of get desensitized after a while, not in a bad way, but in a effective way, meaning you're not allowing the stress of the actual reality of the blood, the guts, the screaming, the crying, the families, with their concern, really cloud your judgment and cloud how you're responding to things. And that really needs to be carried over into the business world. Those tabletop exercises are incredibly important. And I know so few companies that do them. They say they do them. I've done a lot of security assessments of the Fortune 500 because they wanted me to do them. I was called in to do them as a consultant. And what I come to find out is, leadership team says, oh, yeah, we do these all the time. Everything's great. We've got all our ducks in a row. And then you start walking down the ladder a little bit and you talk to the technicians, you talk to the developers, you talk to the incident response and SOC teams if they exist. And you come to find out it's not really that comprehensive and people haven't really gone through it. So unfortunately, I think we're in a state of, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. That's kind of the mindset. And I'm not saying 100%. I think over time it's iterated, meaning that more and more companies have, they've basically been burned by an incident. So now they're like, never again. We're going to actually prepare for them now. And it's not just the cybersecurity incident. It's any incident that can bring risk to the business. It could be a fire. It could be a data center meltdown. It could be a pandemic response. I can't tell you how many phone calls I got that second weekend in March 2020 from senior executives asking me what to do. How do I tell my employees not to come into the office? And how do I effectively get them to work from home? Those types of things like we're solving on the fly. And, I wouldn't call them out on it at that point because that's not the best time to bring it up. But I would later kind of, come around and say, listen, this needs to be part of your incident response plan going forward. Have those press releases ready to go. Have that communication to the employees ready to go. Involve your general counsel. Involve your corporate communications team if you have one. Involve senior leadership so they're not caught off guard wondering what the heck is this, especially if they're very, very senior and they're not very tied into technology. I'm not saying they have to be tied into technology, but the problem with technology is I've noticed that when people don't understand it, it becomes the boogeyman, right? It becomes the Salem witch trials. It's like, well, I don't know what's happening here. So it's all smoke and mirrors and magic, and I need you to figure it out. No, we all need to figure it out together. We need one team that's going to be responsible for the public response, one team that's going to be responsible for coordinating the response to the employees and what the employees need to do, keeping them informed. It gets even more complex when you work for a company like Microsoft or any other company that's kind of in the headlines every day. You have to respond to customer fears and concerns. And there's just so much rumor and innuendo that's going on in the industry that a lot of customers bring all of their prejudices to the table when they're asking you about, what's going on with this vulnerability and why haven't you responded to it yet? And, so you have to have kind of a degree in diplomacy. And, I always say it's like either being a diplomat or working for the UN. Sometimes you have to, especially around things like data privacy incidents, when, there's a data privacy incident maybe in the United States, and then Europe finds out about it, and Europe just goes through the roof. And you kind of have to bring everybody down, calm everybody down first, and start to think about it scientifically, logically, methodically. But you're absolutely right. Measure twice and cut once would be the best approach. But unfortunately, not every company is doing that because they haven't been burned by an incident yet.
It sounds to me like the human element is really key in effectively manage the crisis, right?
Right.
But that's not something that, well, maybe part of the training is in medical school, and the ability to work with patients and their families, so on, help you. But how do you, when you fast forward and you became a CISO, and kind of going back to the storyline, how did you learn how to do that? How to become political? Because it's, again, people think that cybersecurity and technology is all about technology, but really to forget the human layer. And there's, as you mentioned, there's so much politics even in an incident, especially when there are entities that are multinational. I'm sure, like the European and the U.S. Entities are like, okay, well, oh, this guy's had incident. Well, we're like in Europe, it's never going to happen to us. And they butt heads because culture clash, maybe some political clashes. Especially not just in healthcare, but everywhere else, financials, retail, whatever. So maybe tell me about that, about your experience and how you learned how.
Condition of animosity.
You basically summed it up.
Yeah, it really is. I don't know if you spent a lot of time in other countries rather than the United States, but we've got our friends, but we also have people that don't like us very much, and it's not always our fault. But that's another story for another time. But right away, it's the same thing when you're working for Microsoft. It's here we go again with another. Microsoft did it again, and I'm not speaking for Microsoft, but I know that at least personally, I know that I've been subject to that kind of scrutiny. Oh, Microsoft sucks, and now you're coming to me to apologize and explain what happened. But it really isn't that. I mean, I think across the board, all software companies, anybody who's running software, anybody who has data that they need to protect, they're going to come across. They're going to come up against this because people do things that they shouldn't be doing, not just maliciously, but people do things under pressure, like they send out, employee information without encrypting it, or, they send it over clear text SMTP, or, they just do things because they're trying to get their job done. And I try not to blame the victim, really, or they fall for these phishing attacks and so forth. And, right away, I think human nature is like, oh, let's blame and shame, but calm down. Let's first remediate the problem that's right in front of us, figure out what went wrong, and then take a methodical approach on trying to prevent it from happening again. And we'll know we can't prevent anything at 100% because the world is risk. All life leads to death is what sometimes I say. That's the only thing that's certain.
That is pretty morbid, no?
Well, it's realistic. It's pragmatic. It's not.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have to walk around with a shadow over you, but at the same time, I think it's pragmatic to understand that bad stuff happens. I think the bumper sticker says shit happens. It's all about how we respond to it. That's what really defines us as leaders, as go-to people in the industry versus kind of, pretenders, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you get that mindset? I think it's something you just have to develop on your own. I mean, I've done a ton of research and reading around emotional intelligence and fight, flight, or freeze response. Psychology was something I really enjoyed undergraduate. I also enjoyed it when I was in medicine. It's just, you have to kind of dig into what people's motivations are, and really take a journey of the self and understand okay, let's take a look at a time in my career where I've responded badly, or maybe I could have done a better job. Why is that? What was the cause of that? What is wrapped up in that, right? What am I protecting? Am I protecting my ego? Is there any kind of childhood trauma that fits into this? Maybe I've been burned before by a similar thing, and I'm gun shy at this point. Right, because we're dealing with this primordial response of fight, flight, or freeze. That's like the firmware in our BIOS, in our
Yep.
cerebrum, and even the brain core, brainstem. And it's a very difficult thing to fight. Many times, the mind, from a psychological standpoint, it has structures in it that prioritize the negative versus the positive. And you'd ask, well, why do we do that? Well, we do that for survival, because as a primitive race of humans, you want to prioritize when the bear's coming after you versus when you burn yourself and you accidentally cut yourself with a stone. One thing is life threatening, the other thing is inconvenient, right? So you're not, versus, oh, I had a good hunting session, or I had a bumper crop this year. Those things are kind of put on the back burner. You celebrate for 5 minutes and then you move on. But those big incidents where a opposing village comes and raids your village, or there's a bear that attacks, or there's whatever it happens to be, those things are going to be prioritized, and we're going to react vigorously to those things. Well, it's the same thing with modern thinking. Where when bad things happen, we tend to overextend, or it's hyperbole in our brains because we're engineered that way. So to get away from that, I think takes a lot of self-examination, understanding how we're reacting to things, understanding, taking a moment to understand heart rate, blood pressure, breathing, understand that it's not the end of the world. It may or may not be a life or death situation. And if you respond appropriately, the outcomes will most certainly be better than if you respond in a more, flight or freeze kind of situation.
It's absolutely incredible that we're discussing this now. That our primordial ancestors and the way we are, I guess, programmed. Pun intended. You know, tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of years ago actually makes affects the way we react to modern day cybersecurity crisis. Which is, it's a great thesis, I guess, for another, PhD student to maybe like to do the anatomy or like the psychology of a crisis, right? It's, I don't think that maybe there's some research done about that, but I completely agree. The way we react today has a lot to do with, our inherent DNA attributes and how we react to that, the flight of fight mode, and so on, as well as like, things like the recency bias, right? Where we tend to fear things that we hear about, like recent, and then ignore things that were not as common and we don't hear about. There's a lot of that going on. So tell me a bit about you were treating people, physically treating people, and then you moved into the tech space, and then how did you kind of move from that to had some very senior position as a CISO in some very large companies, and you grew like you very quickly. I mean, that's I looked at your the way you progressed your career was almost like, not to say overnight, but it was very, very quick.
Yeah, it's a little deceptive because I was a closet tech person. I'm not a big fan of the word geek, but all right, let's just geek. But I was absolutely, as a child, from the time I was about 8 years old, 8, 9, 10 years old, I was absolutely obsessed with telecommunications. Now, one might say, oh, computing, right? Well, yeah, computing was a part of it, but computing was the gateway into like the phone network, or Bell Telephone and AT&T at the time. Computing was the way into other computers, right? So mainframes and minis and those types of things. And I was absolutely obsessed with figuring out, how does this stuff work? Is this magic? When I press the buttons and I hear the pulses on the other line. So I'm old enough to remember when you press the buttons on the telephone, it was a pulse and then it was a dial tone later on. But the pulses, what do those pulses stand for? What do they do? How do you connect from one to another? How does this whole thing work? And then when I make a long distance call, how is that different than a quote unquote regional or local call? What is it? When I use my modem and I demon dial and I hit something that responds to that modem, what is that on the other end? And how do I get into that? Once I get into it, what does it do? And, what is it all about and why is it there? And, it was just that obsession that kind of carried me through high school, grade school, high school. I didn't go to middle school because it was grades K through 8 when I grew up. High school, college, and even to an extent, and more so in medical school, where I was really introduced to things like Gopher and Elm and Pine and Emacs and all that VI and all that stuff that was kind of like the precursor to how you would communicate using a browser on the internet, right? And then the Mosaic browser came out, and it was only available for Unix for many years, and then you had to kind of emulate a Unix terminal or a Unix operating system in order to get the browser in front of you, or connect into it, do a kind of a screen share of a Unix system in another room or another place in order to get the Mosaic browser up and play with that. So I think, necessity was the mother of invention for me. It's like I needed to get from point A to point F. And in order to do that, I had to figure it out as I went along. There was no one there to kind of say, oh, come to a SANS course or come to an ISC squared course or whatever it is these days. Right now, there was no like ethical hacking course that you could take. You had to go up on, random bulletin board services and download text files and try and figure things out. For me, it was a big puzzle to be solved. Whether that was solving it through social engineering information away from engineers, which I did, or dumpster diving and grabbing manuals at the back of Bell Telephone and down in Basking Ridge, New Jersey, or I think that's where it was, or or basically like just finding things or buying books online, not online. I was going to say online. Back in the day, you had to send a self-addressed envelope with the money in it, and they would send back. They'd stick a book or a pamphlet in the
Do
envelope.
you, do you, I mean, people have it so good these days. All they have to do is just look, search on YouTube, and basically everything's there. But back in the day, you had to make an active effort to feed your curiosity. Do you think it has something to do with like it's almost like a filter? Back then, only the kind of the few that really really wanted it had the ability to go get that information because it was such an effort.
Yeah, well,
Now people complaining that they can't, like they're asking questions. I was like, well, Google is your friend. You're like YouTube is your friend. There's like so much stuff out there available for you.
yeah. I mean, I have my moments where I'm like, do you want me to Google that for you? But I can't be elitist and rude. I know how tough it was, and I remember the early days when I left medicine and I went to work for IBM. There were engineers at IBM. We would call them, and BBN as well, because later on I worked for BBN or GT Internetworking. If anybody knows who that is, if you know what Loft Heavy Industries is, most of the folks from Loft worked at BBN in the security team. So I worked with them. I was kind of shoulder to shoulder with them during those years. And there were two types of engineers, two types of quote unquote hackers or people like me. You had your wizards who thought they knew everything. They could be younger, they could be older, and any question was greeted with discern. No, that's not a word. I'm just making up words now. They greeted with derision, and they'd look at you like, "What's your problem?" and "Don't bother me," right? Like if I had a quick question around a C program that I was trying to compile, or just whatever it was, right? DNS, right? Hey, can you guys, add a domain, or can you delete this zone, or can you change the TTL on the C name, or whatever it is, right? So, you get like, well, I'm not going to do that until you buy me a pizza. Like if they'd even talk to you, right? And then there was this other realm, like folks like Pete Zatko and Chris Weissopel, Mudge and Well Pond, and those guys embraced you. You had a DNS question, and 5 minutes later, Mudge would be running down the hallway with his bind book, and say, "Here, read this. I really would like you to understand more about it." Right. And you were like, "Whoa, like that's something I've never encountered before." So there were those people in my career that really, helped me with things in terms of not so much help me, but pointed me in the right direction. Right. It's like teach a person to fish rather than catch the fish for them and give it to them. Right. And they really did a great job in helping me, kind of filling in the gaps of my knowledge that I hadn't figured out on my own. And then there were others too. It wasn't just the folks in the Unix and the Linux world. There was also folks in the Windows world as well that I was very fortunate enough to work with or kind of be around and just kind of look over their shoulder while they were doing their magic. And I think that's really what propelled me into these roles. The other thing too is getting out of my office, getting out of my cubicle and actually meeting people, talking to people, understanding what the business actually did, how it made money. Right. I didn't come into this with an MBA. I didn't come into this with some sort of graduate program certificate from Harvard or some business school. You had to, if you were just going to stay with the technology and not really understand business risk, that's a recipe for disaster. You're going to stay where you are forever because you're going to be good at what you do, and they're never going to take you out of IT, meaning your mentors and so forth.
What's amazing, not to cut you off, but it's just what's amazing is that you've done that early. Now, early in your career, you're aligning business with the tech. Now it's almost everybody talks about it, and it's almost trivial, but only in the past several years it became almost a trend. What you're describing now is something you've done many years ago, right? You were already doing that when at least 10, 15 years ago, you're aligning the, as you mentioned, getting out of your cubicle, figure out how the business operate, how to generate revenue, and what you need to protect. That's pretty amazing. That's like, very forward thinking. again, now as everybody talks about it, it's trivial, but back in the day when you were doing that as a CISO, it's not the case so
Well,
much.
I think kudos to my father who owned a security company after he left. He left the world of plastic. He was really involved with plastics early on, and the creation of like polycast plastics and things like that, Astrodome type stuff. But he left that world and he went in and he created his own physical security company where he would do things like install security systems, fire alert systems, smoke alert systems, carbon monoxide, CCTV. Sometimes he was tasked with tapping phones. Don't ask me who tasked him with that. I'm not going to answer that question. I took what I learned in the physics from him and just observing really in the physical realm and applied it to the virtual or the digital realm, right? Because why would those two things be different? Just because one may not understand the digital or virtual realm doesn't mean it doesn't behave the same way as the physical world, right? So if you want to protect assets, whether they be physical or digital, you have to first figure out what the heck they are. And, unfortunately, IT is, kind of wrapped around the axle with, oh, my SMTP relay is open and those types of things, but not really understanding, well, let's look up the food chain a little bit. What does that actually really mean, right? Oh, and, somebody could relay false emails off of your, forged emails off of your SMTP server. Okay, and what does that do? Okay, that starts a phishing attack. Well, what does a phishing attack do? That initiates the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain, with identity theft and being able to impersonate a user, and then being able to elevate privilege, and that. So on and on and on and on. It's like, well, don't just focus on the arithmetic, the division, the multiplication. Understand what it actually manifests itself, right? To find the area of a donut, to be able to build the Eiffel Tower, those types of things, right? Understand how this stuff manifests itself in the physical world because business leaders are only really interested in making money, right? And one thing that inhibits you from making money is a
Shocking
loss, right? Risk and loss factor in, and there's all kinds of risks. There's digital risk, IT risk, but there's also risk to the physical plant. There's risk to the supply chain. There's risk to fraud. There's risk in fraud. There's risk in sanctions, in reputation, on and on and on. There's risk in spending too much money, right? And that's why we have accountants, and understanding or not making sales numbers, right? All of that is essentially the same thing. And unfortunately, I think many IT professionals who want to get into cybersecurity, they don't see that. They kind of, I don't know, maybe somebody needs to take a poll. But the next time you're on a consulting gig and you're doing a security assessment or something else, take an IT person aside and ask them, what does your business do? Right? Well, if it's a hospital, that's pretty obvious, right? But if maybe it's a hedge fund, or maybe it's a medical device manufacturing company or a pharmaceutical company, tell me the brands that your company has. Tell me what the most important brands are to your company. What's your biggest sellers? Who are your biggest customers? How do you reduce risk in those areas? I worked for a sensors and controls company where one of our largest customers was a automotive manufacturer. But it was really key to know that because they were the ones that were so emphatic about protecting the data that they were sharing with us so that we could sell them OEM parts back into their systems, right? Because their designs of their vehicles were trade secrets, and they were very, very concerned that we might lose their trade secrets on their behalf. They didn't want that to happen. And then they wouldn't be our biggest customer anymore. They wouldn't be our customer anymore. That's a huge impact on the business. And one would say, well, what does that have to do with cybersecurity? Well, it has everything to do with cybersecurity. Because if you've got a rogue engineer that's making a sensor for this customer of yours and they decide, oh, look at how great my work is, let me go ahead and publish this on the internet, you got a big problem. Because now you're publishing your customers' trade secrets on the internet along with your own stuff. And that they might not look at that favorably.
And how do you keep your curiosity alive? After all those years, now you deal with some very large organizations. You work for with a large organization, and how do you keep abreast of all the latest change? And we talked about how, potentially a knowledge that you gain, years back is not current. How do you make sure that as you mentioned, you're very technical. Obviously, you grew into this role, but because of your curiosity and being technical, how do you make sure that that is something that is keeping on, and you're able to still have that conversation today with your clients and clients you consult with?
Yeah, it's interesting. I always say it's not my customer's job to keep up with what Microsoft is doing, and I'm there to help explain it and try and explain it in such a way that it's easier to understand, which is always a challenge, right? Because the diagrams you get are from dyed-in-the-wool engineers, and you're presenting in front of executive leaders. And what you want to do is kind of like, don't even worry about the technology. This is what the user experience is going to be, et cetera. How do I keep up with it, though? I want to be able to answer the question you've actually asked, which I'm notorious at not doing. That'd be a detective's worst nightmare. But I think I'm a little bit obsessive about really keeping up to date of what's going on in the industry. And you can see by my LinkedIn posts, I use Feedly a lot. I use RSS news feeds, etc. I kind of let artificial intelligence and machine learning go out and scour the internet for me to bring information that I'm really interested in to the forefront. And, I've learned how to speed read. I learned that years ago when I was, doing the whole science medicine thing. Kind of do a once over to understand what's going on and what's going on now. I think, speed to press and, being the first to know something is pretty important. Well, not the very first, but at least among the first to know something. It's pretty important because your customers are going to come back at you and go, well, what about this thing that was just announced this morning? And I never want to be caught short and go, what are you talking about? Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. You kind of have to be on top of that. I think once I retire, I'm not going to care anymore. And then that basic knowledge still comes in, right? So I talk about things changing, but in the analogy with medicine is the humorous is still the humorous, right? The brain is still the brain, right? You have to understand that these things exist. Just like you have to understand the underpinnings of an operating system or how TCP/IP works in order to really wrap your head around how those things can be exploited. What can go wrong in that realm? So it doesn't hurt to get that foundational knowledge, whether you get it on your own or you get it through some formalized training. I learn best on my own. I'm not great with formalized training because my brain doesn't work that way. And I understand that could be considered a weakness, whatever, or then you could throw shade at the way learning is done. But at the end of the day, you really should be compelled, if you're a cybersecurity professional or somebody who's an advisor, that should be part of your job, is to understand what the heck is going on in my industry and how does it affect the rest of the world? Not just an insular view of like what's going on with my industry. Oh, there's a vulnerability in an Apache log system. No, it's how does that affect the business? How does that affect your customers? And what are the best ways to pour water on that fire so that the customer doesn't get burned or customer doesn't hurt themselves in the process?
And what type of problems do you currently working on when you deal with some, I'm supposing, you get called for specific reasons or, whether there's a crisis or not, but you have to deal with some major, major incidents or, when you reach out to the customer, what does it look like today for you? Like, is that a type of engagement?
In some cases, you have to learn how to take your beatings. My former boss, no names mentioned, he moved on to another company, but my former manager here at Microsoft said that, a large part of the job is just getting beaten up by CISOs and their architects for, the sins of the father, if you will, or the misunderstandings of the customer. Right, an educated consumer is our best customer. That's an old Cy Sims suit company motto, but it really helps when you've got an educated customer out there who understands that when a 0-day vulnerability is found, you just go to press and go, hey, we found this vulnerability without actually having a patch for it. So a lot of what I do is just sitting and listening and empathizing, because I've been in those shoes. I know what they're dealing with, because they're getting pressure from their business to say, what the heck? Why are these systems offline, or why are we being compromised? Those types of things.
And I'm sure it carries a lot, a lot of weight, that the fact that you are in their shoes. So they look at your background and say, well, this guy, knows what he's talking about because he talks from experience, right? So that probably takes takes care of at least having that clout, to be able to speak about it, right? What technologies do you, and kind of trends in technology, and specifically in cybersecurity, excites you today? That's kind of the like the last question, and I feel like we haven't even scratched the surface. We're probably going to have to do a second part of this.
I'm chatty. I apologize.
No, it's perfect.
It's
Thank you
for a living.
Fascinating conversation.
Yeah. So what excites me, was beyond anything else. It's the thing I was always trying to achieve, not just personally, but every team I was with. Zero trust, which didn't have a name. We used to call it perimeterless computing back when it was just the Jericho commandments back in like 2003, 2004. This concept of data is not always going to stay behind the four firewalls of the organization. Data is, by its very nature, is going to flow freely. Say that 10 times fast. With the advent of email and the fact that you can attach something, unstructured data, to email. I mean, right then and there, back in the 70s, we already had a method for getting data out of the organization into another party's hands, right? So how do we do that appropriately, right? So, and that's really where zero trust comes in. And I'm not talking about specifically SASE or segmented networks. I'm talking about access to resources, a resource that can be absolutely anything: an operating system, an application, a piece of unstructured data, a database, a platform, or a network segment. Access to a resource based on the risk of the device and based on the risk of the identity. Understanding those two things before access is granted, and maybe doing some remediation on those two things before access is granted. That's going to be the carrot stick model that's going to bring us into the next century. The old model, if the old model worked, there would be no cybersecurity industry. The old model never worked. And the old model meaning, I got firewall, I got antivirus, I've got proxy, and I prevent people from going to certain sites. I'm all set.
Defense in depth.
It just does not work.
Right.
It can't work, because guess what? The business is going to go around it. It's just like water. Water goes wherever it can, right? It's always going to go to seep to the lowest point. So if I've got a legal team in my group, in my company, or I've got a marketing team in my company, or sales team in my company, data's going to, or an R&D team that needs to collaborate with the outside world, data's going to flow. Data's going to do what data do. It's going to be one of those things that, instead of trying to block everything, why not actually understand what's going on, understand the risk of something before granting access, have visibility into where the data is going. Is it an appropriate movement of data? And if not, right, maybe we can protect that data before it moves out. Maybe we can, have a LoJack attached to that data where we can pull that data back and revoke access to that data even after it's left our domain, right? And I say domain not in the technical term, but domain of control, if you will, right? I accidentally send something somewhere and realize I sent it to the wrong recipient, and I'm like, holy heck, I just sent a lot of really proprietary information, and I'm going to lose my job. Well, if that's protected with some sort of information rights management, and I can pull the key remotely from that attachment, the recipient's not going to be able to open that attachment, which is perfect.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not going to close before we maybe talk a bit about maybe some more morbid stuff. Since we started, maybe we kind of have a closure. Anything that scares you in terms of the trends? I know that a lot of people are talking about AI and machine learning being utilized, by the wrong people, and talking about like some, vulnerable SCADA networks and the next, cybersecurity world, world war that's happening behind the scenes. Anything like that?
Well, just keep in mind, anything can be used as a weapon. I could, an
That's right.
AR-15 or a brick, right? So artificial intelligence, machine learning can be used as a weapon. Nuclear energy can be used as a weapon. Messing with the traffic lights can be used as a weapon. The fact that everything is interconnected is both a blessing and a curse. It's a blessing because we have instant access to almost everything, and our lives have become super convenient. The flip side of that is there basically is no privacy. And yes, everyone needs privacy. I don't care if you say, "Oh, well, I don't do anything wrong." That's subjective, right? The next regime might think you're doing something wrong, even though you're not doing anything wrong now. That might not be the case in 50 years. Anyway, the other thing that's a little scary is our critical infrastructure is now interconnected. I hear about air gaps all the time, but when you really start to dig in, you realize nothing's really air gapped, especially if you can gain physical access to it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the kind of stuff I think we should be cognizant of, that nation states have kill switches on each other. And by kill switch, what I mean is you could wake up one morning and realize that the ATM doesn't work. There's no water or hot water, or the water's, poisoned, or, there's no electricity and there's no internet. And that's going to be a problem, right? We really kind of need to look at that and at least have somebody working on that, just like we have somebody working on near Earth objects, so that if, a large asteroid gets into our orbit and it's going to hit the Earth, we can kind of move it or blow it out of the sky, right? It's the same. It's like, low probability of that happening, but if it happened, the impact is very, very high. So the risk is still there.
I can't not ask the question about if you ever watched the Don't Look Up movie.
Oh yeah, I watched it the second it came out, and I so related to that because they go into the Oval Office and they're trying to convince this team of idiots of risk, right? They're uneducated, they're political, they're biased, they're media driven, and I mean, how many times have we gone into senior leadership and said, "Hey, we've got a smoldering, dumpster fire over here, and somebody needs to do something about it. I'm volunteering. I'll take care of it." Well, how much money do you need? Well, I need $2 million. Well, forget about it. We can't invest that right now. And then when something bad happens, they come back and they go, "Well, why did that happen?" And I'm like, "Well, don't you remember our meeting in April?" It's like, wake up, people. Come on.
Yeah, I wonder if they're gonna make another version of that, but on kind of the cybersecurity event. That because basically it'll be almost the same experience where you come in and trying to explain to people what's happening, and it goes over their head, and this whole thing just turned into a one big show like it is in the movie. Probably something like that. Joseph, like before we part ways, I would love to tell people how to best reach out to you. We're gonna probably do a part 2 of this. But for now, what's the easiest way for people to reach out to you for, consulting, for feedback, anything else that they may wish for them to do?
Yeah, I've been told it's super easy to find me if you type the 3 things into your favorite search engine: Joseph Davis, Microsoft. You'll probably get my LinkedIn profile, which will allow you to message me. My LinkedIn profile is public. If you want to connect with me, connect with me. I'm not like one of these people like, "Oh, you have to have my email address in order to connect with me." I don't find myself to be that self-important. If you're trying to sell me something, I'll probably block you. But I'll tell you first, and if you're persistent about it, then I'll block you. But outside of that, I do my best to respond to everybody that messages me or tries to get in touch with me, especially if it's something that that's mutually something that we both care about, or if somebody's looking for mentorship, or somebody's falling on hard times, etc. I'm really open to those types of things.
Super awesome. And I think this interview will show up as well when they Google your name next time. And anybody has questions for Joseph, post them in the kind of the chat here, and then we'll probably answer it in part B of this conversation. So until then, thank you very much all for joining. Thank Joseph for sharing the time today, and much appreciated. It was a fascinating conversation, and looking forward to having you in the next session.
Awesome.
Take care all, and
Great
be
day.
safe.
You
Take
too.
care.